Hey, what is up everybody? Platform Disciple here, and today I'm going to be doing a discussion that I think is pretty important. Let's first just hop right into important news. You only have a few more days left to pre-order Rebellion, and if you have extra LP or IP, now is the time to spend it. Get those platinum cards, get those rewards. Highly recommend it. That being said, this leads us into our discussion, which is how the Rebellion set will affect the game moving forward. So, as you probably know, the meta currently is pretty solidified because there has been very few changes to the game over a long span of time, which means that people have had a lot of time to test and see what decks work and what decks don't really work. With the addition of waves 1 through 3 of Rebellion, there has been, some changes, but nothing colossal. And we'll have to see if the last wave of Rebellion really changes things more. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I want to say in this video. A few notes written down. So let's start by talking about what happens when a new set is released in a card game. And there is going to be change. Let's talk about different kinds of change. So there's creep, and then talking about power creep and efficiency creep. And you've probably heard of power creep, which is when new cards are inherently more powerful than old cards, which is bad. That generally, although it does get people excited about the new cards, it's not good because if it keeps happening set after set, it means the game keeps getting bigger and bigger in terms of power level. Older cards become irrelevant, and it just turns into a monster show where cards are going to be just unfair. Not unfair in the sense that, they're giving players advantages over others, but unfair in the sense that they may have too large of an impact on the game, especially the real risk is early on. Then the other thing we have is efficiency creep, which you probably haven't heard of, which is even if you release cards that are not more powerful than existing cards, you make every deck more efficient slightly by giving them more options of viable cards to run. Examples from Rebellion thus far: Splitter Light and Cowardly Recruit are both cards that I don't think are drastically stronger than other cards in the slot, but they're good enough that they may increase the overall efficiency of decks that can take advantage of those cards. And there are other things like this. So every existing deck is going to get a little stronger because there's going to be one or two cards that are going to go from the Rebellion set into these existing decks. And you're already seeing this from waves 1 through 3. People are using a few of those cards in decks that already existed. And then the most important thing about a new set is whether it can change the meta. And by that I mean shift around which decks are in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and or introducing new decks entirely. All right, so a new deck would be created by a set of cards that either promote using specific cards. For example, Regicide forces players to use a unusual faction combination to take advantage of the card, which may introduce a new deck. I can't promise the deck will be strong or not. I can't promise Regicide will be strong or not, but it would be a new deck type to see Varroa and Overseers together. Another thing that could happen is a new card is released that plays efficiently with other cards from older sets, introducing a new kind of deck. Then there are other ways the meta can change, which is that an existing deck, preferably one that's weak right now, gets a lot stronger. And that can happen by releasing a card that just overall improves the strength of the deck. So for example, if Descendants of the Dragon got like a super, super, super good 2-drop, then you might be seeing a more prevalent Descendants of the Dragon meta, much more of that faction showing up, whereas right now you're not. Just not hating on your DoD fans and stuff, but right now it's just not as popular as a faction as some of the other factions. And then the last thing that can happen is that an existing powerful deck gets weaker, either by a card being printed that directly counters the deck, or by other decks getting stronger while that deck doesn't, or lastly, a deck that is an inherent counter to a strong deck gets super strong, and therefore the deck that gets countered is just going to have to be played less because you run the risk of getting countered every game. So ideally, we want to see cards change the meta. But one thing that we run into is that I think a lot of the decks and cards in the game right now are already really, really, really efficient. So it's difficult to imagine certain cards and or certain decks really being shifted around much. So right now, I want to say that there's a set of decks and or factions that get played a lot more than others, and I think there are some exceptions to this. So I think that Genesis, Varor, and Flame Dawn are all just like really, really, really prevalent in this meta, and like I said, there are some exceptions. And there are certain cards in these factions that cater to this. So, like I said, there's efficiency creep. So when the new set comes out, every deck's getting stronger, but it's also worth noting that that means that generally the game is going to be decided a lot faster, or it has the potential to be. So for the new cards to be relevant, they have to be able to survive the speed of the current meta. Like if they print a super, super awesome like 9-cost legendary for Descendants of the Dragons, it doesn't matter if Descendants of the Dragons doesn't have the tools to survive until turn 9. And if Descendants of the Dragon does have the tool to survive till turn 9, like they print another effect similar to Yuan-Shi's Wrath, spelled Yuan-Shi wrong, but they print another effect similar to Yuan-Shi's Wrath, then it's not the 9-cost card that's making the difference. It's the effect similar to Yuan-Shi's Wrath that's making the difference. So it's once again something that's impacting the game early that's making the difference. So I think that, and this is my prediction, that it's very possible that the tier 1 decks that we're looking at right now are still going to be the tier 1 decks when Rebellion comes out. And when Rebellion does come out, there is going to be a period of time where the meta is just crazy because everyone's trying all these different things. But when the dust settles, like a few months later, the question is going to be, what are going to be the top dogs? Are things going to have changed that much? And ideally they would have, but it's very possible they wouldn't have. And I'm going to talk about why. And like I said, Genesis, Varor, Flame Dawn. There are a few perpetrators and some specific cards. Some of it's the overall factions. For overall factions, I want to say that Genesis and Flame Dawn both have the ability to pressure the game much, much more than other factions can extremely early in the game. And forcing the other factions to play defensively, or any deck to play defensively, gives these decks an inherent advantage. In particular, Flame Dawn, because of its extreme abundance of... Okay, it didn't actually find things with charge, it found things with overcharge. But because Flame Dawn has a extreme abundance of characters with charge, it can pressure the game at all stages, and your opponent has to be wary defensively all the time, even if you have no characters in play, because out of nowhere, something like Cavalry Paladin can just hit the board and get in for a pretty substantial amount of damage. So that's just worth keeping in mind. And whereas if you look at something like a slower faction like Warpath, it takes a lot for Warpath to get going. And although when it does get going, it can be very powerful, it needs the tools to survive up to a point in the game. And if it can't keep up with the speed of these other factions, then, that's that. So let's talk about some cards that I think are holding other factions back and holding new cards back. And by that I mean there's a couple cards that I think are so strong that it's not possible for new cards to compete with them in terms of the viability of cards or not. And let's start by talking about Clore. I think Clore is one of the biggest perpetrators of this issue, which is that there's no way they can make a card for Double Flamed On that is going to replace Clore in the command zone. And there's not really any card right now that competes with Clore in the command zone for Double Flamed On or Triple Flamed On. If you're not playing Clore in your command zone in this kind of deck, it's a mistake. You're playing a strictly worse deck. And I mean that in all seriousness. There's the opportunity cost for using Clore is extremely low because there's nothing else that can compete with him. There's no way you can have a better card. And he also is a card that, like I said before, is deciding games very early on. If they have a way to kill Clore, then the game can proceed as normal. But if they can't kill Clore, Clore can run out of control. And we've got Agent Coil Mechborn is a very similar situation. Admittedly, Agent Coil Mechborn, there are other cards you can run instead, but is another card that if it isn't killed early, it can run out of control. And both Clore and Agent Coil Mechborn are generating a lot of pressure on the board without you actually playing cards from your hand. So your opponent may play multiple cards to deal with these characters, even though you only spent one card, very low resource card that doesn't make up a large portion of your deck, just to stop them. Like these two cards can win the game by themselves, is what I'm saying. And the decks that use them can still win the game without them. So even if they kill Agent Coil Mechborn really early, or even if they kill Clore really early, those decks can still win. Whereas if they don't, then the person that can't kill it is just automatically loses. So either, and I'm repeating myself, either Agent Coil and Clore get killed and the game proceeds as normal, or they don't get killed and the player with those cards just almost auto wins. And these cards are so fast and so efficient that they lock other cards and other strategies out of the game. Moving on, another card similar is Rita, which generates a lot of artificial card value, and it's I think something that prohibits other cards from really excelling. It's so good at what it does. I don't think Rita is broken. I don't think Clore's broken. I don't think Agent Coil Mechborn's broken. But these cards are cards that might prevent new decks from coming out. That the decks that are using these are just super, super, super efficient. And although the new cards might make those decks stronger, it's hard to imagine that the decks using these cards are going to get weaker enough that other decks are going to be able to join the spotlight. And although this isn't a specific card, I want to bring up that Tinker Combo is so efficient right now that it's hard to imagine that it's going to lose its place as tier 1. And it's so strong that I don't think any card from Rebellion is worth using in it. And admittedly, the rest of the set could be different, but as of now, these cards are just not strong enough and don't cater to the overall strategy of Tinker Combo. And once again, It's about this early game pressure. I didn't talk about Rita enough, but Rita, although... Why is Rita not showing up? Aha. Rita, although Rita doesn't generate like as much pressure as Clore or Agent Coil Mechborn do, Rita does generate artificial card value by generating characters for free, and they can ultimately be used for something like Death Blast, or they can take advantage of Bromic's banner, which is, or Bromic himself. Man, gotta show entire collection. So Rita's generating a lot more pressure than she really ought to, I think. And the other side of it is that Rita can stall very well, and that's very important for these cards that are deciding the game very early, like against Agent Coil Mechborn. Being able to generate a blocker that doesn't cost you a card in hand every turn is pretty huge. And Tinker Combo is similar to these other cards in that Aether Acolyte can be very, very big without you losing cards in hand, because Tinker and Gather Thoughts and all these other effects. So the common theme here is that we've got a lot of cards that are just have a massive impact on the early game, but cost the player using those cards very, very little in terms of the way of they're playing the game. That it's very, very difficult to punish a player for using these cards because the decks aren't really reliant on them. It's just that if they aren't dealt with early, they're gonna